Con ustedes, Brian Reed, Cybersecurity Strategy Director de Proofpoint.
Hello, Mexico. My name is Brian Reed. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity Strategy here at Proofpoint, and I'm going to be talking for a little bit about taking a people-centric platform approach to the modern threat landscape. We all lived through the pandemic, and in 2020, people became the perimeter as it relates to security. The move away from the classic network infrastructure was already happening before COVID-19. But unfortunately, COVID became the change agent for all of the people who were very slow to make that movement toward cloud applications and cloud storage and moving beyond the traditional confines of your data center. With that movement, ultimately, people became the perimeter, and what was needed was a people-centric platform to help support the security policies and the security controls that you wanted to put around your users to protect them and make sure that they were using applications and data in the proper and secure ways. Unfortunately, attackers have been focused on people for a long, long time. From the defender's point of view, the classic security approach has been to secure things based on perhaps market category or geography. So let's protect our network infrastructure with firewalls and network intrusion detection and intrusion prevention. Let's protect our file shares with maybe server sensors and software that's looking for file movements. And let's protect our networks with things like VLAN segmentation and elaborate rules. The problem is that attackers don't necessarily care about your infrastructure, and your infrastructure is much less important now that many of our users are working in a remote fashion or might be working in a hybrid fashion, where some of the times they're on premises and some of the times they're working from literally anywhere. This problem also applies to our third-party business partners and third-party relationships we might have, as well as all the supporting members of our supply chain. Unfortunately, attackers were already at home in the cloud. And if we look at Office 365, which has been one of the major applications that has made us move to the cloud, attackers have already been using things like malicious OAuth apps and malicious OAuth authorization requests, been staging information in the cloud, have been looking at attacking credentials and compromising users within Office 365 already. Proofpoint's own threat intelligence data supports this. Approximately 93% of all organizations have been targeted, and 50% of orgs have users that have been compromised. And almost 1 out of 5 orgs have some sort of malicious OAuth app installed or being used alongside their Office 365 implementation. So Proofpoint alone in 2020 has seen nearly 67 million messages that were targeted at our Proofpoint customers that are using Office 365, that have their email infrastructure hosted there and their messaging infrastructure hosted there. Again, attacks are increasingly targeting people, not infrastructure. We've seen that the latest threats on the modern threat landscape are using things like social engineering and not vulnerabilities. And we'll get into some of the metrics behind that from people like Verizon with the Verizon data breach investigation report here in a moment. But the shift to cloud has created new threat vectors and new ways that data can be exposed. If we look at Verizon, last year's 2021 data breach investigation report, the DBIR, has said that 85% of breaches involve some sort of human element or human interaction. And the two most sought after data types from attackers are credentials and personal data. And the reason for that is that attackers are trying to move laterally. They're trying to learn more about your organization. If we look at email fraud, and the last 5 years, the FBI and IC3 report has noted over $26.2 billion US has been lost due to business email compromise. email is certainly the number one threat vector out there facing you. And if we look at the origins of many of the common types of modern attacks, whether we're talking about first stage ransomware, whether we're talking about credential phishing, most of those attacks are started with an email message. Email is the central point of identity for a lot of the other applications and data that you use in your organization today. While attackers have been focused on people, most defenders out there have not. And if we look at this chart on the left, this is a map of Gartner's forecast of information security spending worldwide for the next 6 years. And what they pointed out at the end of 2020 is that nearly 75% of security budgets are tied up in network protection and endpoint protection. If you look at the things that actually affect people, that are people-centric in nature, looking at things like security awareness, certainly email, but also protecting cloud applications and web security, that spending is a minority of the spend, but it's a majority of the problem. If we look at that Verizon number of 85% of breaches involving some sort of human element, I would certainly make the argument that we're spending in some of the wrong places. And this is why it matters. The top 3 risks facing enterprises today are certainly data breaches. Verizon's data breach investigation report is out, as well as a number of other primary threat intelligence reports back this information up. So again, Verizon pointing out that 85% of breaches involve some sort of human element, and 61% of breaches involve credentials in some way. So again, the other interesting metric here is only 3% of breaches involve exploiting some sort of vulnerability. That does not mean that patching and vulnerability is not important at all. It means that attackers largely do not care whether you've applied a patch or not. They're looking at attacking people, not infrastructure, not products or locations. Second of all, ransomware, if we look at the successful attacks via email, it's staggering. Again, email phishing is the largest component of this. Certainly ransomware first stage is still propagated by vulnerabilities out there like remote desktop protocol and other software vulnerabilities, particularly those against VPN programs. And then finally, I mentioned business email compromise losses are mounting. If we look at the losses out there, according to the FBI and IC3 report, basically half of all cybercrime losses are related to business email compromise. So Proofpoint has looked at the problem landscape. We've looked at the modern threat landscape, and we realized that in order to do an effective job of protecting our customers, we need to start with protecting the number one threat vector. If 85% of all attacks involve some form of human interaction, and many of the big problems today, like ransomware and business email compromise, originate with email, we better be sure that we have a complete end-to-end email security solution that looks into visibility and control around users. We need to take that rich information that we're using and learning and all of that primary threat intelligence that we're doing about domains and users and entities, and we need to apply that to protecting people. And then we also need to protect what people access. So if we look at how the world has changed, even in the last 2 years, many of you are using cloud-hosted applications. You're using SaaS applications like Office 365 and Salesforce and ServiceNow and Workday and so many others, tens of thousands of other applications. We need to make sure that we're looking across the entire scope of the things that people are accessing and that we have adequate protections in place for them. And that protection across a platform manifests itself in a number of distinct products. Again, in order to have a solid people-centric platform, you need to have a platform that's based around getting visibility into the threat landscape. If you look at where Proofpoint is at today, certainly from an email standpoint, we're the number one deployed solution across Fortune 100s, Fortune 1000s, Global 2000s. But just having a wide amount of customers and focused on email is simply not enough. We need to also be looking at cloud accounts. We also need to be using multiple different types of detection capabilities, whether those are static or dynamic detection capabilities, whether we're training different machine learning models. One of the things a lot of people don't realize about Proofpoint is Proofpoint several years ago acquired emerging threats. And we have thousands of intrusion detection sensors around the world, and we're updating our emerging threat pro rules multiple times a day with things like known botnet locations and signatures, known command and control, phishing signatures. So we're building all of that intelligence into our products. We're building that threat intelligence into things that you could consume in other locations, like your firewalls and your UTM devices at the network edge. Along with that, we're taking all of this threat telemetry, and we're populating what we call our Nexus threat graph so that we can start solving some more advanced problems. We just announced earlier this year our Supernova capabilities around business email compromise defense. What this means is a lot of times business email compromise is not about clicking a link. It's not about an attachment. It's trying to phrase an email in a way that you're getting your users to take some action. And we need to parse that language and do things like natural language understanding and natural language processing to better understand the context and intent behind a message. And this message might not just simply be an email. It might be a Slack message. It might be a Teams message. Proofpoint's also announced earlier this year our teams for data loss prevention, where we're taking advantage of a lot of these capabilities in here. We have an entire portion of our business dedicated to archiving and compliance, where we're doing the same thing across a number of other collaboration platforms. So it's about taking the rich threat intelligence that we're gathering and making it actionable within a platform through very distinct solutions. Taking a step backwards from threat intelligence, it's not just all about threat intelligence. It's about understanding who represents risk to your organization. In my past life as a Gartner analyst, I talked to a number of CISOs and CIOs and even CEOs and boards. And the two most common questions that came up when it relates to security is, who are my riskiest users and what makes them so risky? For those of you who are familiar with Proofpoint, many of you have probably heard about VAPs, or very attacked people, or very attacked persons. VAP can also stand for vulnerability, attack, and privilege, in order to help you better calculate people risk. So from a vulnerability standpoint, who is likely to fall for threats? From an attack standpoint, who are my most highly attacked people? Who's getting targeted by those serious threats that I know are a big problem? And then finally, from a privilege standpoint, who has access to valuable data? Or if my credentials were taken from an individual, who has permissions perhaps that might be beyond what they really need? One of the problems with many organizations is, particularly for longer tenured employees and individuals, you go through and you continuously get credentials, you get access, you get ways to get into other systems, you gather permissions over time. Very seldom do you go through and relinquish those positions and those permissions and those credentials. So we need to really address vulnerability, attack, and privilege when we look at people risk. So again, some critical questions we need to answer around taking a people-centric platform approach to security. Who are my riskiest people? What makes them so risky? We also need to think about the applications and data themselves that might be at risk. We talked earlier about Office 365 in many ways being a launching pad for cyber criminals due to things like malicious OAuth apps and other ways that you can take credentials and reuse them from Office 365 for other applications. We need to also think about insider risks and insider threat. It's not just about attacks coming from the outside world, it's the problems and the issues from within, perhaps. Do I have users that might be accidental or careless or negligent? Do I have truly malicious users within my organization? Or do I have users that may have been compromised and somebody has completely taken over their account, their identity, and their credentials? And then finally, how do we tie all of this together and accelerate our incident response investigations? So one way that Proofpoint helps do that is through what we call our Nexus People Risk Explorer. Now, for those of you who are Proofpoint customers and you have a Proofpoint bundle with us, this is actually a free interface. This is hosted at Proofpoint. It ties in all of your targeted attack protection data from email, ties in all of your cloud security data from your cloud access security broker and your cloud account defense. And it also ties in your security awareness training and other inputs like your Active Directory and your identity from your organization. And it can actually help you visualize and calculate who are my riskiest people and what makes them so risky. For instance, I might have users that are clicking on too many things. I might have users that are using third-party applications that are unsanctioned or unapproved. Or I might have people connecting from unique or strange locations that people usually don't operate or connect from. So putting all of that together, I can also look at the security controls that I have in place, and I can adjust those controls accordingly. I might be looking at protecting users in a certain department. I might be looking at protecting my executives a little bit differently than my finance group, as an example. Proofpoint ultimately has 3 people-centric platforms that we use to help protect our customers. We have our threat protection platform, we have our information protection platform, and we have our compliance platform. So our people-centric threat and information protection, those first 2 really focus on those last 2 problems I mentioned earlier about protecting people and protecting what they access. So over email, web, cloud, your entire ecosystem, really taking a view of what are the threats that your organization faces? What are the information assets you have that are critical? How are your users creating and accessing and sharing applications and data, and how do we need to go about protecting those? So if we drill into the first one, threat protection, we have a number of different components across the Proofpoint platform that can help you. Certainly, we mentioned email being the #1 threat vector out there. Email gateway defense is a huge way to address this problem. Also looking at things like if you do have users that click on a link, how am I going to handle that? If it's a link that's unknown, can I create a email browser isolation session when they click on that link? Can I redirect them to do a lookup for threat intelligence on that link? Is it being hosted from a known command and control site? Is being hosted from a known phishing site where somebody could compromise their credentials? Also, it's important to note things like email fraud defense and looking at supplier risk. Is my entire supply chain do I have confidence in them, or do I have maybe suppliers or partners who have had known security issues in the past? Do they have things that aren't properly configured? Are they utilizing perhaps technologies like DMARC and other identity verification technologies that can help make sure that I have a higher degree of confidence in sharing information with those suppliers and partners? From a security awareness standpoint, a lot of this is to help deal with the accidental or careless or negligent users out there potentially, using things like simulations, training modules that are context-driven and focus on the things that you want to focus on. Cloud and web security, certainly having a range of being able to not just tie in with the APIs and monitor how users might be uploading or downloading or sharing information within Office 365 or Google Workspace, or Salesforce or ServiceNow, but also about actually detecting and mitigating threats and understanding how that collaboration and sharing is taking place between different users within those applications. Finally, tying all this back to people, looking at the risk analytics around my people who are very attacked, who are very privileged, who might be very vulnerable. How are we doing securing them? What sort of recommendations can we take to be proactive to protect before something bad might happen? The second part of this puzzle, the second major platform component, is our information protection and cloud security. So it's not just good enough, maybe the world of legacy data loss prevention or DLP is something you're very familiar with, but DLP have been traditionally very focused on content inspection. While understanding the content is important, it's also equally important to understand the behaviors of your users. Why are people making the decisions that they're making with data? And what sort of threats are you facing with those users accessing data? Do you have somebody who has compromised somebody else's account or taken it over outright, and somebody is masquerading as another user? Proofpoint offers a number of solutions to help with that problem around information protection and cloud security. And one of the terms that you're going to start hearing from many vendors out there, including us, as well as many industry analysts like Gartner, is this term called SSE, or Security Service Edge. And the idea around Security Service Edge is security policy and administration that follows the user, that brings all of these, what used to be separate products and separate focus areas for people together. Many of you may have a DLP administrator. You might have a cloud architect or a cloud security admin. Security Service Edge, or SSE, is going to attempt to bring that together in a singular purpose-driven platform. And then finally, extending people-centric security to compliance, understanding that, do I have people that have taken adequate compliance training? I might have certain types of communication that need to be secured and captured and understood between different users. I might also need to archive or save that information for a certain amount of time, maybe due to regulations or some sort of regulatory requirement. I might also want to monitor things like social media presence of those within my organization, or how does my organization look from a social media perspective to the outside world. These are all important considerations that go into driving people-centric compliance and building analytics around those kinds of things. Finally, one of the big points that I mentioned was around what can we do to accelerate incident response investigations. Many of you have dozens of security tools and security vendors that you're working with within your organization and within your environments today. This can be a problem, especially if you have a security incident that comes up. Where do you start? Do you look at endpoint security logs? Do you look at the network? Because those are the two areas where Gartner is saying that you're spending about 75% of your spend. Most incident response investigations tend to start at the endpoint or looking at network telemetry. Are you looking at app security or data security or cloud security? The problem is that many of these ad hoc investigations, you're bouncing between several different consoles and several different views, trying to put together a unified picture of everywhere that a user went, everywhere that a file has gone, everybody who has gone to a certain web location. This can be time consuming. It can be inefficient. You can ultimately be missing context to where you might close out an investigation too soon, or you might not fully understand the scope of a security incident. And that can leave you with those blind spots and create a high amount of risk. What Proofpoint has done is launched a multi-channel unified alert management interface. So our unified alert management system ties in all of those separate products to a single interface where you can triage things like security incidents and events across cloud and email and web and endpoint and isolation events. You can look at specific user activity. You can pivot on a specific file or a specific URL. And you can get all kinds of information that you might need to go today between a number of different tools to correlate and put together. If you want an additional demo on this, this is something that our Proofpoint team can help you out with. You can certainly visit us, and we'll be glad to walk through a demonstration of this for you. The other thing that's important about having a unified alert management interface or a unified management system is that it's not good enough for Proofpoint to have all these products and do things on our own. We need to work well within the ecosystem of vendor solutions that you already have. You might be using something like Palo Alto Networks at the firewall. You might be using something like CrowdStrike for endpoint protection. You might be using identity solutions like Okta. You might be using privileged access management like CyberArk and SailPoint for identity governance. It's important to pull all of that information together. And one of the things that we do in our unified interface is we expose all of our API data so that you can very easily tie that in with maybe something like a SIM solution you have. You might have Splunk or Exabeam in your environment. And we can take all of our information, share it with those tools so that you might get a broader picture, even with some of the things that you're not seeing in our interface. From an automation standpoint, security orchestration and automation response, you might want to automatically remediate phishing incidents when you see them. If you don't have things like our threat response auto poll and our clear from Proofpoint, you might want to use additional tools to do things like blocking URLs at the firewall and automating those firewall rule creations dynamically. This is a great opportunity if you use a SOAR platform like Palo Alto or Splunk, Phantom, or something like that. You can take those automated actions based upon what we're seeing, and we can feed into those systems. Same thing with ticket management for help desk and for security incidents, as well as communications. So exposing all of our APIs like this makes it really easy for you to help build automation and have us work well in your security ecosystem with the vendors that you have today. I mentioned a moment ago with that security ecosystem, some of the integrations that we do with leading vendors. Here's a few examples that I went through. Certainly doing things like gathering different network-based malware detection from Palo Alto Wildfire and using that within our solution. Sharing things like device information and endpoint information from CrowdStrike with what we're seeing. Certainly Okta with looking at your very attacked people and looking at the identity controls that you have around them. Same thing with SailPoint and governing that identity access. And then finally, CyberArk, looking at things like privileged access management and how do I protect and respond to attacks against those who might be very privileged in my environment. So finally, why should you take a look at taking a people-centric platform approach to security? Well, first of all, we established that the number one threat vector out there, which is email attacks, is the best, fastest, and cheapest way to lower the risk of a breach. People are ultimately out there creating information, they're using applications, they're accessing data, they're communicating with others. We need to have an increased level of risk monitoring to be able to understand what they're doing and why they're making the decisions they are with applications and data. Proofpoint is also number one in visibility. If you don't know who your high-risk people are in your organization, you don't really understand your attack surface. And you certainly, if you're not looking at your own people, the best that you're doing is really taking an outside-in approach at security, which is really a 20th century approach at the firewall motto of let's just go ahead and block everything from the external world or look at everything from the external world and not look from the inside out. You're really at best solving for half the problem. The best way to focus on the real risk is to focus on understanding your users, understanding the context and the reasons why they're making some of the decisions that they're making. Also having security that you can report up to the board, metrics that matter and mean something is really important. And that really ties into the operational impact. I talked a little bit ago about accelerating incident response investigations, and security operations teams really struggle here. If you can do things to reduce the time, money, effort that goes into your security investigations, there's a huge return on investment that you can get for your organizations. You can spend on other things that really matter. You can not spend the wrong way, as I talked about earlier, where we're spending a majority of our security spend on things that aren't really solving the security problem. Again, better effectiveness is the best way to solve alert fatigue, really understanding the context and the reasons behind the alerts that you're seeing. And this ultimately takes burden off of your team, your users, and your downstream controls. With that, I want to thank you for your time. Please enjoy the rest of the conference. And if you're interested in anything that we talked about here in this presentation, please visit either proofpoint.com or one of our Proofpoint people at the conference. Thank you.
Agradecemos a Brian Reed por su participación en el IT Solutions Day.